I still remember the exact moment my mother looked me in the eyes and called me dead weight. I was 17, standing in our cramped kitchen in Queens, holding my acceptance letter to art school. The envelope was crumpled from my sweaty palms, and I had practiced the conversation a dozen times in my head. I thought she'd be proud. I thought she'd finally see that I had potential. Art school? She scoffed, not even looking up from the stack of bills she was sorting through. Maya, you're living in a fantasy world. You think you can just draw pictures for the rest of your life while the real world passes you by? I tried to explain that. It wasn't just drawing, that graphic design was a real career, that companies needed creative professionals. But she cut me off with a wave of her hand, the same dismissive gesture she'd used my entire childhood whenever I shared a dream or ambition. Listen to me carefully, she said, finally looking up with those cold, calculating eyes that had haunted my teenage years. You are dead weight in this family. Always have been. Your sister Lisa is in pre-med, making something of herself. Your brother Carlos is studying engineering, and you want to play with crayons. The words hit me like a physical blow, dead weight. I had heard her call me lazy, unrealistic, a dreamer, but never dead weight. It felt final, like a judgment that couldn't be appealed. I work 2 jobs to keep this roof over your head, she continued, her voice growing sharper. I sacrifice everything for you kids, and this is what I get. A daughter who thinks she's 2. Good for real work? I wanted to remind her that I had been working part-time at the local grocery store since I was 15, that I bought my own clothes and supplies, that I had never asked her for anything more than basic necessities. But I knew it wouldn't matter. In her mind, I was the problem child, the one who didn't fit into her narrow definition of success. Mom, please, I whispered, holding up the letter. Just look at this. It's a good school. I got a partial scholarship. She didn't even glance at the paper. Scholarships don't pay for everything, Maya. And what happens when you graduate? You think someone's going to pay you to doodle? You think you're going to support yourself making pretty pictures? The kitchen felt smaller with each word she spoke. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on her face. I could hear Mrs. Rodriguez's television blaring through the thin walls. Some Spanish soap opera where people screamed at each other in passionate desperation. It felt appropriate. I won't pay for this nonsense, she declared, turning back to her bills. If you want to waste your life chasing impossible dreams, you'll do it on your own dime. But don't come crying to me when reality hits you in the face. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, clutching that letter like it was a lifeline. The acceptance letter that had made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I was worth something. The scholarship that proved someone believed in my potential. All of it reduced to nothing by the woman who was supposed to support me unconditionally. That night, I lay in bed staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a bird in flight. I had been staring at that stain for years, imagining it was a sign that I would someday soar above this suffocating environment. Now it just looked like a brown blotch, meaningless and ugly. I thought about my mother's words, turning them over in my mind like stones in my pocket. Dead weight. Was that really how she saw me? As a burden that dragged the family down. I thought about Lisa, who had always been the golden child, the one who brought home perfect report cards and never questioned authority. I thought about Carlos, who was steady and reliable, the son who would take care of our parents in their old age. And then there was me, the dreamer. The artist? The dead weight dot, but as I lay there in the darkness, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the first glimpse of the strength I would need in the years to come. I decided that night that I would prove her wrong. Not to win her approval, I was beginning to understand that might be impossible, but to prove to myself that I was more than the sum of her low expectations, I would go to art school. I would find a way to pay for it, even if it meant working 3 jobs and living on ramen noodles. I would succeed in spite of her predictions, not because of her support. And someday, when I had built something meaningful with my life, maybe she would see that her dead weight daughter had been carrying dreams all along. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen where my mother was making coffee. She didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence. It was as if our conversation the night before had never happened, as if she had already erased me from her calculations. "I'm going to art school," I said quietly, my voice steadier. Then I felt she finally looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Surprise? Regret? But it was gone so quickly, I might have imagined it. "Fine," she said, turning back to her coffee. "But remember what I told you. Don't come crawling back when you fail." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I won't," I promised. And for the first time in my life, I meant it completely, moving to Manhattan for art school with $300 in my pocket and a duffel bag full of clothes was either the bravest or most stupid thing I had ever done. Probably both. I found a tiny studio apartment in Chinatown that was barely bigger than my childhood bedroom, but it was mine. The walls were paper thin, the heat barely worked, and I was pretty sure the previous tenant had been running some kind of illegal operation, based on the strange smells and suspicious stains, but I loved it. It was freedom. I worked at a coffee shop near campus from 5 in the morning until noon, then attended classes until evening. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, but I would stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning working on assignments, pushing myself to be better than everyone else. I had to be. I couldn't afford to be average. The other students came from different worlds. Many of them had parents who were artists or worked in creative fields. They talked casually about family vacations to Europe, about their parents' connections in the industry, about trust funds and safety nets. I listened to these conversations with a mixture of envy and determination. They had advantages I would never have, but they also had something I didn't want: the luxury of failure. I couldn't fail. Failure meant proving my mother right, and that was unacceptable. My professors began to notice my work. Professor Chun, who taught advanced graphic design, pulled me aside after class one day during my junior year. "Maya," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone professors use when they're about to say something important. "Your portfolio is exceptional. Have you thought about what you want to do after graduation?" I had thought about it constantly, but my plans were still vague. "I want to work for a good agency," I said. "Build up experience, learn the business side of things." She nodded thoughtfully. "There's a small agency downtown, Meridian Creative. They're looking for an intern. It's unpaid, but the experience would be invaluable. The owner, David Kellerman, is a friend of mine. Would you be interested?" Unpaid. The words hit me like a slap. I was already working 40 hours a week at the coffee shop just to pay rent and eat. How could I afford to work for free? But I also knew that this was exactly the kind of opportunity that separated the dreamers from the doers. The kind of chance that my mother would say I was too impractical to take. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I'm very interested." That semester, I worked at the coffee shop from 5 to 9 in the morning, interned at Meridian Creative from 10 to 4, and attended classes from 6 to 9 at night. I was running on coffee and determination, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. My classmates started to worry about me, asking if I was okay, if I needed help. I appreciated their concern, but they didn't understand. This wasn't desperation, this was investment. David Kellerman was a tall, intimidating man with gray hair and eyes that seemed to see through everything. He rarely spoke to the interns directly, but I could feel him watching me, evaluating my work, my dedication, my potential. I made sure he had reasons to be impressed. When one of the junior designers called in sick, I volunteered to finish his project. When a client needed revisions on a weekend, I was there. When the coffee machine broke and everyone was complaining, I brought in my own espresso maker from home. Small gestures, but they added up. 3 months into my internship, David called me into his office. "Maya," he said, not looking up from the papers on his desk, "you've been here for 3 months. What do you think of the company?" I had prepared for this question, but I decided to be honest instead of diplomatic. "I think it's a good agency with talented people, but I think you're missing opportunities in digital marketing. Most of your clients are still thinking in terms of print and traditional media, but consumers are moving online faster than businesses are adapting." He looked up then, really looked at me for the first time since I had started working there. Interesting. Go on. I've been researching your current clients. 60% of them don't have functional websites. The ones that do have sites that look like they were designed in 2005, they're losing business to competitors who understand that branding isn't just about logos and business cards anymore. It's about digital presence, social media engagement, user experience. David leaned back in his chair, studying me with those penetrating eyes. And you think you understand digital marketing? I think I understand change, I said. And I understand that businesses who don't adapt to change don't survive. He was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I had overstepped. Maybe I should have been more humble, more grateful for the opportunity I had been given. But I was tired of being humble. I was tired of making myself smaller to fit into other people's expectations. How would you like a job?
He asked finally. I blinked, sure I had misheard. A job? Junior designer position.
$35,000 a year to start. Your main focus would be developing our digital services department, building it from scratch. Essentially, $35,000. It was more money than I had ever imagined making, especially right out of college. But more than that, it was validation. It was proof that I had value, that my ideas mattered, that I wasn't dead weight. I accept, I said, probably too quickly. David smiled for the first time since I had known him. Good, you start Monday, and Maya, don't prove me wrong. That night, I called my mother. I hadn't spoken to her in months, not since she had made it clear that my choices disappointed her. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. Maya, is everything okay? I got a job, I said. A real job. At a design agency in Manhattan. There was a pause. Oh, well, that's good, I suppose. How much does it pay? When I told her the salary, she was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. That's more than I make, she said finally. And I could hear something in her voice I had never heard before. Uncertainty. I know, I said gently. Mom, I know you were worried about me. I know you thought I was making a mistake. But I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be more than okay. Another pause. Well, she said, and I could hear her pulling herself together. Rebuilding the wall between us. Don't get too comfortable. The art world is unpredictable. Make sure you're saving money. I wanted to argue, to point out that I had already proven her wrong. That maybe it was time for her to admit that her dead-weight daughter had found her wings. But I didn't. I just said goodbye and hung up, holding on to the small victory of that. Uncertainty in her voice. It was the first crack in the wall she had built around her opinion of me. And I was determined to make it bigger. 5 years into my career at Meridian Creative, I had built something that David Kellerman couldn't ignore. The digital services department had grown from my one-person operation to a team of 8, generating nearly 40% of the agency's revenue. I had proven that I understood not just design, but business. I could read a client's needs, translate them into creative solutions, and deliver results that made their phones ring and their profits grow. But I was restless, working for someone else, no matter how good the job was, felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. I had ideas that were too big for Meridian's conservative approach. I saw opportunities that David was too risk-averse to pursue. I was making good money, $75,000 a year by then, but I was making even better money for someone else. The breaking point came during a meeting with a potential client, a small tech startup that was looking for a complete brand overhaul. The founder, Jessica Liu, was a brilliant woman about my age who had developed an app that helped small businesses manage their social media presence. She needed everything: logo, website, marketing materials, digital strategy. David quoted her a price that made her face fall. I understand it's a significant investment, he said in his most professional voice. But quality branding is essential for long-term success. After the meeting, Jessica approached me in the lobby. Maya, right? You're the one who's been handling the digital side of things? I nodded, curious about where this was going. Can I ask you something? Hypothetically, if you were to handle a project like mine independently, what would you charge? I looked around to make sure David wasn't within earshot, then gave her an honest answer. It was 60% less than what Meridian had quoted. And I knew I could still make a healthy profit. That's what I thought, she said. Look, I know you work for David, and I respect that. But if you ever decide to go out on your own, I'd love to be your first client. That conversation haunted me for weeks. I ran the numbers over and over, calculating how much I would need to survive on my own. How many clients I would need to match my current salary. How much I could potentially earn if I built my own agency. The math was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I started working on a business plan in secret, staying up late researching incorporation procedures, insurance requirements, office space options. I wasn't just dreaming anymore, I was planning. The final push came when David brought in his nephew, Marcus, as a consultant for the digital department. Marcus was fresh out of college with a marketing degree and no real-world experience. But he had opinions about everything in David's ear. Within a month, he was questioning my strategies, undermining my decisions in front of clients, and generally making my work life miserable. Mia, David said during our quarterly review, Marcus has brought some interesting perspectives to the team.
He thinks we might be overcomplicating our digital strategies.
I looked at David, this man who had given me my first real opportunity, who had trusted me to build something from nothing, and I realized that our relationship had run its course. He was no longer seeing me as the asset I had become. He was seeing me as the employee I had always been. David, I said carefully, I've been thinking about my future here, and I think it might be time for me to explore other opportunities. He looked genuinely surprised. Are you unhappy with your compensation? We could discuss a raise. It's not about money, I said. It's about growth. I've learned everything I can learn here, and I think I'm ready for the next challenge. We negotiated a 2-month transition period during which I would train Marcus and wrap up my current projects. It was professional and cordial, but I could see the disappointment in David's eyes. He had invested in me, and now I was leaving. I felt guilty about it. But I also felt alive in a way I hadn't in months during those 2 months. I quietly reached out to some of my favorite clients, letting them know about my transition. I didn't poach anyone. That would have been unethical and unprofessional, but I made sure they knew how to reach me if they ever needed independent creative services. Jessica Liu was my first call. Maya, I was hoping you'd get in touch. Are you really doing this? I'm really doing this, I said, and saying it out loud made it feel real for the first time. Good. I have 3 other startup founders who are looking for exactly what you offer. Are you ready to hit the ground running? I was ready. I had been ready for years. I incorporated as Phoenix Creative Solutions, a name that felt appropriate for someone rising from the ashes of other people's limited expectations. I rented a small office space in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, bought some used furniture, and invested in the best computer equipment I could afford. My mother called while I was setting up my new office, paint still drying on the walls. Maya, your sister told me you quit your job. Please tell me you have something else lined up. I do, Mom. I started my own company. The silence stretched so long I thought she had hung up. Your own company? Maya, do you have any idea how many small businesses fail in the first year? Do you have a business plan? Do you have enough savings? Do you have health insurance? I had answers to all of her questions, but I realized she wasn't really asking for information. She was expressing her fear that I was about to prove her right. That I was about to become the failure she had always predicted. Mom, I know you're worried, but I'm not 22 anymore. I'm not that scared kid with big dreams and no experience. I've been building toward this for years. Building toward what? Unemployment? Her words stung, but they didn't devastate me the way they would have 10 years earlier. I had evidence now. I had proof of my capabilities. I had clients who trusted me and colleagues who respected me. Building toward independence, I said. Building toward the kind of success that can't be taken away by other people's decisions. Success? She scoffed. Maya, you had a good job. You were making decent money. Why would you throw that away to chase another impossible dream? Another impossible dream. As if everything I had accomplished meant nothing. As if I was still that 17-year-old girl with an art school acceptance letter, begging for her approval. Because, Mom, I said, looking around at my new office, at the space where I would build something entirely my own. Some dreams are only impossible if you don't work hard enough to make them real. After I hung up, I sat in my empty office and made a promise to myself. I would succeed not to spite my mother, but to prove that her definition of success was too small for the life I intended to build. Within 6 months, Phoenix Creative Solutions had 12 clients and was booked solid through the end of the year. Within a year, I had hired my first employee. Within 2 years, I was turning down projects because I didn't have the capacity to take them on, but the real test was still coming. By the time I turned 32, Phoenix Creative Solutions had grown beyond anything I had dared to imagine during those sleepless nights when I first incorporated those endless, coffee-fueled hours hunched over my laptop in that cramped studio apartment that smelled perpetually of takeout containers and determination. The apartment where the radiator clanged through winter nights and the neighbors upstairs seemed to practice tap dancing at 2 a.m., where I'd spread business plans across my kitchen table like battle maps, sketching dreams with pens that barely worked and calculating budgets on the backs of pizza boxes. We had 23 employees now, each one carefully chosen through interviews that lasted hours. Each one a testament to the vision I'd been building brick by painstaking brick, person by person, project by project. They weren't just employees. They were believers, creative souls who understood that we were building something different. Something that valued innovation over convention, authenticity over quick profits. Our offices in both Brooklyn and Manhattan buzzed with the kind of creative energy you could feel the moment you walked through the doors, walls covered with mood boards and award certificates. The constant hum of collaboration, the scent of good coffee mixing with the excitement of ideas taking shape. Our client roster read like a who's who of the most innovative companies in the city, companies that had once seemed impossibly out of reach when I was cold calling from my studio apartment, companies whose executives I'd dreamed of impressing while I practiced pitches in the mirror. Startups that had grown into industry leaders, established brands that had trusted us to reinvent their digital presence, nonprofits whose missions we'd helped amplify across platforms they'd never imagined using. I wasn't just successful, I was thriving in a way that felt sustainable and authentic. The kind of success that came from staying true to my values rather than compromising them for quick gains. The kind that let me sleep soundly knowing that our work actually mattered. The financial crisis of 2019 had actually worked in our favor. Like a storm that clears away dead branches to let new growth flourish. Like a forest fire that creates space for seeds that have been waiting years for their chance to sprout. While larger agencies were laying off entire departments in panicked board meetings, scrambling to understand remote work technologies they'd dismissed as passing fads just months before, we were already nimble and digitally focused. Our team had been working remotely for years out of necessity rather than choice. We couldn't afford the overhead of traditional office space when we started, so we'd learned to collaborate across time zones and platforms to build relationships through screens, to create magic through fiber optic cables. Our processes were cloud-based before cloud-based was cool. Our communication seamless across platforms that other agencies were still learning to pronounce. We used project management tools that felt intuitive to us but mystified our competitors. Held video meetings that felt natural while others struggled with muted microphones and frozen screens. Companies that had been resistant to online marketing, clinging to traditional advertising methods like life preservers on a sinking ship. Executives who'd spent decades believing that real marketing happened in boardrooms and print magazines suddenly found themselves desperate for digital presence. Their carefully crafted TV campaigns were reaching empty living rooms. Their billboard investments were speaking to empty highways. And they were finally understanding what I'd been trying to tell them for years, that the future of marketing was happening online, in real time, with audiences who expected authenticity and engagement, and we were perfectly positioned to help them transition. Like guides who had already mapped the territory they were just beginning to explore, like translators, who could speak both their traditional language and the digital dialect they needed to learn. We became the bridge between old-school business thinking and new world possibilities, helping companies not just survive the crisis but emerge stronger, more connected to their audiences, more relevant in a rapidly changing marketplace. I was in my Manhattan office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Hudson River, the view I dreamed about during those early days when I could barely afford coffee and counted quarters for the subway. The same view I'd imagined while sitting in that cramped studio apartment, visualizing the office I'd have someday. The space that would reflect everything I was working toward. The office where afternoon light streamed in at just the right angle, where I could watch boats move across the water like toys and feel like I was part of something larger than myself. I was reviewing quarterly reports that showed numbers I still sometimes couldn't quite believe were real revenue that had grown by 300% in the past 2 years. Profit margins that would have seemed impossible when I was calculating whether I could afford both groceries and internet. Client retention rates that spoke to relationships built on trust and results rather than convenience. The spreadsheets told a story of steady growth, of calculated risks that had paid off, of a business that wasn't just surviving but thriving in ways that felt both surreal and inevitable. When my assistant Sarah knocked on my door, I looked up from the computer screen, blinking away the blur of numbers and projections. Sarah was 24, bright-eyed and efficient, with the kind of organized energy that made everyone around her feel more capable. She had a degree from Columbia and could have worked anywhere, but she'd chosen Phoenix Creative because, as she'd told me in her interview, she wanted to be part of something that was building rather than maintaining, creating rather than copying. She was the kind of young professional I might have been if I'd had different support systems growing up. If I'd had mentors who believed in my potential rather than people who warned me about its limitations. Mia, her voice carried that particular note of uncertainty that meant something unusual was happening. The same tone she used when a client called with an emergency, or when the coffee machine broke down and threatened to derail our afternoon productivity. "There's someone here to see you. She says she's your mother." I looked up from my computer screen, the Excel spreadsheet blurring as I tried to process what I'd heard. Sure, I had misheard. The afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling. Windows suddenly felt too bright, too exposing, like a spotlight illuminating something I wasn't ready to examine. My fingers stopped moving across the keyboard, suspended in mid-gesture as my brain struggled to make sense of Sarah's words. My mother? Carmen Rodriguez? She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important. Sarah's voice carried a note of professional uncertainty, probably picking up on my sudden tension, the way my posture had shifted from relaxed to rigid in the span of a sentence. She'd never met my mother, had probably never even heard me mention her beyond the perfunctory holiday references that came up in casual office conversation. "Oh, I'll be visiting family, or my mother lives in Queens," the kind of neutral. Statements that revealed nothing about the complexity of the relationship they described. I hadn't seen my mother in person in over 2 years, though it felt longer, like a gap that had stretched and distorted with time and distance and all the conversations we hadn't had. We exchanged holiday cards, generic ones from the drugstore with brief, careful messages that revealed nothing of our real thoughts or feelings. Messages like wishing you happiness and hope the new year brings you joy, and the occasional phone call that lasted exactly long enough to confirm we were both still alive and functioning. 20 minutes, maybe 30 if one of us had particularly significant news to share. Conversations that felt like diplomatic exchanges between friendly but cautious nations. Our relationship had settled into a polite distance over the years, like neighbors who wave from their respective yards but never cross the property line, who know each other's routines but not each other's dreams. She had never visited my office, had never shown interest in seeing what I had built from nothing but stubborn determination and sleepless nights, had never asked to meet my employees or understand what we actually did beyond the vague acknowledgement that it involved computers and marketing. In fact, I wasn't even sure she had my office address. Wasn't sure how she'd found me here in this glass tower in Manhattan, in this space that represented everything I'd achieved without her support or approval. "Send her in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, though I could hear the slight tremor that betrayed my nerves. I quickly closed my laptop, the financial reports disappearing with a soft click that felt final, like closing a book I wasn't ready to finish reading. I tried to compose myself, smoothing down my blazer, the expensive one I'd bought at Bergdorf's, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I belonged in rooms like this, that I could afford the uniform of success without. Checking my bank balance first, Anne took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the sudden racing of my heart. My hands were trembling slightly as I arranged the papers on my desk, trying to create an impression of professional composure, even though I felt like that 17-year-old girl again. The one who'd been told her dreams were impossible. The one who'd sat across from my mother at our kitchen table arguing about art school and stability and whether it was better to chase dreams or accept limitations. My mother walked into my office looking smaller than I remembered, as if the years had somehow compressed her, shrunk her from the towering authority figure of my childhood memories into someone more human-sized, more vulnerable. But her eyes were the same sharp, evaluating, taking in every detail with the intensity of an appraiser cataloging valuable items. The same gaze that had once assessed my report cards and bedroom cleanliness and teenage attempts at independence. With equal scrutiny, she looked around at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, where boats moved like toys across the water, and the afternoon sun created patterns of light and shadow on the polished wood floors. Her gaze traveled to the awards lining the walls, each one representing late nights and rejected pitches and eventual triumph. Each one a small victory in the larger war I'd been fighting to prove myself. There were industry recognition awards, client appreciation plaques, framed articles from marketing publications that had featured our work, photographs of our team at various events and celebrations. She studied the expensive furniture that I had finally been able to afford without checking my bank balance first, without that familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach that had accompanied every purchase for years. The leather chairs that had cost more than my monthly rent in that studio apartment. The conference table made from reclaimed wood that spoke to our company's values. The bookshelf lined with marketing texts and business strategy guides and, yes, a few art books that reminded me where this journey had started. Her gaze lingered on my diploma, framed now and hanging prominently behind my desk, the art school degree she'd once called a waste of money. A piece of paper that had cost us arguments and tears and years of disappointment, now displayed like a flag of conquest, like proof of a battle won long after anyone remembered the war had been fought. "Hello, Maya," she said, and her voice was different from what I remembered. Uncertain in a way I had never heard before, lacking the authority that had defined every interaction I remembered from my childhood. Missing the confidence that had once made her pronouncements about my future feel like unchangeable verdicts. "Mom, this is unexpected." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, trying to find my footing in this surreal moment, trying to figure out how to navigate a conversation I'd never imagined having in this setting. The words felt formal, professional, like I was greeting a client rather than the woman who had raised me. "Is everything okay?" She sat down across from my desk without being invited, a small act of defiance that was so characteristically her, that I almost smiled despite the tension crackling between us. It was the same decisive movement she'd made countless times in my childhood, sitting down at teacher conferences, claiming her space in waiting rooms, asserting her presence in situations where she felt uncertain but refused to show it. I noticed. She was wearing her best dress, the navy blue one with the subtle floral print that she saved for special occasions, church services and job interviews. The one she'd worn to my high school graduation, standing stiffly in the auditorium while other parents cheered and took pictures. The one that represented her attempts to look professional and put together even when the world felt uncertain. It was pressed and clean but showed its age in the slightly faded fabric and the way it hung differently on her frame than it had years ago. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and she seemed to be struggling with how to begin, like someone trying to find the right words in a foreign language, like a person who had rehearsed a speech but suddenly couldn't remember the opening lines. "I lost my job," she said finally, the words dropping into the silence between us like stones into still water. creating ripples that spread outward and changed everything. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. I was still processing. I felt a complicated mix of emotions washing over me: sympathy for her situation, genuine concern for her well-being, and something that might have been vindication. Though I tried to push that last feeling away as soon as I recognized it. It felt too small, too petty for this moment, unworthy of the person I'd tried to become. Mom, I'm sorry. That's awful. When did this happen? Last week. They called me into HR on a Tuesday morning, handed me a manila envelope like it was a diagnosis, like it contained test results that would change everything. Her voice carried a bitterness I recognized from childhood. The same tone she'd used when talking about my father's broken promises, about bills that couldn't be paid on time, about dreams that seemed impossible for people like us. 18 years in the billing department. 18 years of perfect attendance and staying late without overtime pay. 18 years of working through lunch breaks and coming in early and never taking all my sick days. And they're letting me go like I'm just another line item on a budget spreadsheet. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was describing exactly the kind of job insecurity I tried to avoid by starting my own business. The vulnerability that came from depending entirely on someone else's decisions about your worth and your future. The very thing she'd warned me about when I told her I wanted to work for myself. Except she'd been warning me about the wrong kind of risk. They called it right sizing, she continued, and I could hear the quotation marks around the corporate euphemism, the way she spoke the words like they tasted bitter. Like there's a right size for destroying people's lives. Like there's a correct measurement for throwing away nearly 2 decades of loyalty and hard work. I could see where this conversation was heading, like watching a movie you'd seen before. But hoping the ending might be different this time, but I let her get there in her own time. She needed to say it herself, needed to find her own way to asking for what she'd come to ask for, needed to maintain whatever dignity she could in a situation that had already stripped away so much of her sense of security and self-worth. The hospital is downsizing, she said, as if the passive voice could somehow make the situation less personal, less devastating. Budget cuts, they said. New management, new priorities. They gave me a month's notice and a severance package, but it's not much. Enough to cover rent for maybe 3 months if I'm careful. If I don't buy anything that isn't absolutely essential. If I live like I did when you were little and every dollar had to be stretched until it screamed. Her voice was getting stronger. As she talked, as if the act of explaining was helping her process what had happened, helping her move from shock toward anger toward determination. I'm 57 years old, Maya. Who's going to hire a 57-year-old woman in this economy? Who's going to take a chance on someone my age when there are 20-somethings willing to work for half the salary and twice the hours? The questions hung in the air between us, rhetorical but real, representing fears that were both personal and universal. The kind of economic anxiety that kept people awake at night, wondering if their experience counted for anything in a world that seemed to value youth and flexibility over wisdom and stability. I've been thinking about what you said, she continued, her fingers working at the clasp of her purse, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. The way she'd fidget when she was worried about money or my father or whether we'd have enough heat through the winter. About building something that can't be taken away by other people's decisions. I never understood what you meant before, but now. She trailed off, looking out the window at the city skyline, at the buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly. Toward the horizon, at the view that represented everything I'd built while she'd been warning me it was impossible. Now you understand, I finished gently, surprised by the absence of triumph in my voice. I'd imagined this moment before, during the hardest times when her doubts had echoed in my head, dreamed of the day she'd finally get it, finally see that. I'd been right about the risks of depending on other people's decisions about your worth. But it felt different now than I'd expected, sadder, more human. Less like vindication and more like shared recognition of a truth neither of us had wanted to learn this way. She nodded, still not meeting my eyes, still staring out at the city where millions of people were fighting their own battles for security, for recognition, for the right to exist on their own terms without having to justify their value to strangers in boardrooms, who saw them as numbers on spreadsheets rather than human beings with bills to pay and dreams to pursue. "I've been working for other people my whole life," she said, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she was realizing something fundamental for the first time. I thought that was security, but it was just an illusion. A comfortable lie I told myself because it felt safer than taking risks, safer than betting on myself the way you bet on yourself. The admission was huge, coming from a woman who had built her entire identity around the idea of stable employment, around the belief that the safest path was the one where someone else made the big decisions and all you had to do was show up and do your job and collect your paycheck and trust that loyalty would be rewarded with security. They can get rid of you anytime they want, for any reason they want to invent, she continued, her voice gaining strength and bitterness. Budget cuts, restructuring, a new manager who wants to bring in their own people, new technology that makes your position redundant, a merger that eliminates duplicate roles. None of your loyalty matters when the numbers don't add up on someone else's spreadsheet. None of your experience counts when they decide they need to save money by hiring someone younger and cheaper. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us, processing the weight of what she was saying, the admission of a worldview crumbling, the recognition that everything she'd believed about work and security and the right way to build a life had been built on foundations that could shift without warning. I could hear the city beyond the windows, car horns and construction and the constant hum of 8 million people pursuing their own versions of survival and success. The soundtrack of ambition and desperation that had been the background music of my entire career. "Maya," she said, finally looking directly at me for the first time since she'd entered the office, her brown eyes meeting mine with an intensity that reminded me of being 16 and arguing about curfew, of being 22 and defending my decision to start my own business, of all the times we'd stared at each other across the divide of different dreams and different fears. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know how hard this is for me." I waited, my hands folded on the desk in a mirror of her posture, trying to project calm professionalism while my heart hammered against my ribs. This was the moment I'd imagined and dreaded and hoped for. The conversation that would either repair something broken between us or confirm that it was beyond fixing. "I need a job." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back and they'd finally broken free. "I know I don't have experience in your field. I know I don't understand all this digital marketing and creative strategy that you do. All these platforms and algorithms and metrics that might as well be a foreign language to me." Her voice was steady now, determined, like she'd practiced this speech in the mirror the way I used to practice client pitches, like she'd rehearsed the words until they felt manageable even though the situation they described felt overwhelming. "But I learn fast and I work hard. I've always worked hard, even when it didn't seem to matter. Even when the work was boring or the bosses were difficult or the pay wasn't enough to cover everything we needed." She leaned forward slightly, engaging with the conversation in a way that reminded me of her younger self, the woman who had fought for everything we'd had, who had made impossible budgets work through sheer determination and careful planning. "I thought maybe you might have something for me. Something where my experience could matter. Where starting over at 57 wouldn't be a disadvantage but maybe even an asset. Where all those years of learning how to deal with difficult people and impossible situations and tight deadlines might actually be worth something." The moment hung between us like a bridge that could either connect us or collapse entirely,
taking decades of complicated history with it.
I thought about the 17-year-old girl who had been called dead weight, who had been told her dreams were impossible, who had sat in this very chair metaphorically asking for support and receiving doubt instead. I thought about all the years of criticism disguised as concern, all the times I had achieved something only to have it minimized or dismissed, explained away as luck or timing rather than skill and determination and the kind of stubborn persistence that refuses to accept other people's limitations as your own. I could have savored this moment. I could have pointed out the irony with surgical precision, made her acknowledge how wrong she had been about me, about my choices, about the path I'd chosen against her advice and despite her warnings. Part of me wanted to, the part that was still 17 and hurt and desperate for validation. The part that had carried her doubts like stones in my pockets for years, weighing me down even as I climbed towards success, but looking at my mother, really looking at her. Seeing past the history between us to the woman sitting across from me in her best dress with her hands folded and her pride carefully contained, I saw something I had never seen before. Fear, real, raw vulnerability. The same uncertainty I had felt when I was starting out. When the world seemed too big and I seemed too small. When every rejection letter felt like confirmation of my mother's warnings. When every small failure seemed to prove that maybe she'd been right about the risks I was taking. She was scared. And she was brave enough to sit in my office, to ask for help from the daughter whose dreams she'd once dismissed, to admit she'd been wrong about everything she'd thought. She understood about security and success and the right way to navigate. A world that didn't care about your loyalty or your good intentions or your decades of showing up and doing your job without complaint. What kind of work are you interested in? I asked, my voice softer than I'd intended, gentler than the voice I used in business meetings or client presentations. It was the voice I might have used with a friend who was struggling with someone. I cared about who needed help finding their way forward. Relief flooded her face like sunrise breaking over dark water, like the moment when pain medication finally kicks in and you remember what it feels like not to hurt. Her shoulders relaxed, her hands unclenched. And for the first time since she'd walked into my office, she looked less like she was bracing for impact and more like she was allowing herself to hope that this
conversation might end differently
than she'd feared. Anything, she said, and the word carried the weight of genuine humility, of someone who had been stripped of the luxury of being particular about her options. I'm good with numbers, always have been. Good with organization, keeping track of details, following through on tasks that other people forget about or put off. I can answer phones, manage schedules, handle billing and invoicing. I've been doing medical billing for 18 years. So I know how to deal with insurance companies and complicated payment systems and people who don't want to pay what they owe. She was selling herself now, and I could see how much it cost her to list her qualifications like items at an auction, to reduce decades of experience to bullet points that might or might not be relevant to what I needed. I know how to work with difficult people. 18 years in hospital billing teaches you patience, teaches you how to stay calm when someone is screaming at you about charges they don't understand or payments they can't afford. Whatever you need, whatever would be helpful, I can learn it or figure it out. I thought about our current staffing needs, mentally reviewing the conversations I'd been having with my management team about expansion and efficiency, about the administrative gaps that were starting to show as we grew larger and more complex. We had been talking about hiring an office manager for our Brooklyn location, someone to handle the day-to-day logistics that kept a creative agency running smoothly, someone who could be the steady presence that allowed the creative types to focus on their work without getting bogged down in logistical details, someone who could manage vendor relationships and keep track of project timelines, who could handle the less glamorous but absolutely essential work of making sure invoices got sent and payments got processed, who could deal with the personality conflicts and scheduling challenges that were inevitable when you put 23 creative people in the same space and asked them to collaborate on tight deadlines. I might have something, I said, watching her face carefully, noting the way her eyes sharpened with interest and hope. It would be office management, handling scheduling and vendor relationships, some basic bookkeeping and client billing, making sure invoices get sent and payments get processed on time, keeping track of project timelines and deadlines, managing supplies and equipment, being the person who makes sure all the small details that keep a business running don't fall through the cracks. I paused, thinking about the salary range we'd discussed for the position, about what would be fair for someone with her experience, even if it wasn't direct experience in our industry. The pay would be $45,000 to start, with full benefits, health insurance, dental, vision, 2 weeks paid vacation to start with, more after your first year, sick days, and a retirement plan with company matching. Her eyes widened, and I saw her do the mental math, calculating what this meant for her immediate future. For the rent and groceries and small dignities that unemployment threatened. For the possibility of rebuilding some version of the security she'd lost when the hospital decided she was redundant. 45,000? Maya, that's more than I was making at the hospital after 18 years. The irony hit both of us at the same time. I was offering her more than the secure job that had just disappeared. More than the safe path she'd always advocated for. More than the position she'd held for nearly 2 decades at an institution she'd believed would always need her services. It's a fair wage for the work, I said simply, though internally I was noting how strange it felt to be in this position. To be the one offering stability to the person who had once worried that I was too much of a risk taker to ever build anything. Reliable. She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. Processing not just the job offer, but everything it represented, the role reversal. The admission that her approach to career security hadn't been as secure as she'd believed. The possibility of working for the daughter whose dreams she'd once dismissed as impractical. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile peace we were building, might break. The spell that was allowing us to have this conversation without falling back into the old patterns of criticism and defensiveness that had defined our relationship for so many years. I owe you an apology. I felt my chest tighten, years of longing and resentment and complicated love converging in my throat like a knot that made it hard to breathe. Hard to speak, hard to know what I wanted to say or how I wanted this moment to unfold. Mom, you don't... Yes, I do. She straightened up, finding some of her old strength. The backbone that had carried her through single motherhood and financial struggles and all the small indignities of working-class life. All the times she'd had to swallow her pride and ask for help or accept charity or make do with less than what her family deserved. I was wrong about you, she said, and the words came out clear and strong. Like she'd been practicing them, like she'd finally found the courage to say what she'd been thinking for months or maybe years. I was wrong about everything. I was so afraid of seeing you fail that I couldn't see you succeed. I was so worried about you being hurt by disappointment that I became the one hurting you. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with implications and possibilities, with the potential for either healing or further damage depending on how we chose to handle it. I felt tears threatening and fought them back, blinking rapidly, and focusing on the framed photo on my desk, the Phoenix creative team at last year's holiday party. All of us laughing at something someone had said, looking like the kind of workplace family I'd always dreamed of creating, the kind of supportive, professional environment I'd wished I could have had when I was starting out. I called you dead weight, she continued, and I could see how much it cost her to say the words, to acknowledge the exact phrase that had haunted me for years, that had echoed in my head during the hardest moments of building my business, during the times when I'd wondered if maybe she'd been right about my limitations and unrealistic expectations. But you were never dead weight, she said, her voice getting stronger with each word. You were the one carrying dreams for all of us. You were the one brave enough to try, to risk failure for the chance at something better. You were the one who refused to accept that the way things were was the way they had to be. The tears came then, for both of us, years of misunderstanding and missed connections. Years of love that had been complicated by fear and expectations and the weight of wanting different things. Of dreaming different dreams. Of having different definitions of success and security and what it meant to build a good life. Years of me trying to prove I was worthy of support. And her trying to protect me from a world that seemed designed to crush people like us, people who didn't have safety, nets or family money or connections that could smooth the path towards success. I'm proud of you, she said, and they were words I had waited my entire life to hear. Words that sounded different than I'd imagined they would, quieter, more real, less triumphant, and more healing. Less about vindication and more about recognition. About finally seeing each other clearly after years of looking through the distortion of fear and disappointment and unmet expectations. I'm proud of what you've built, and I'm proud of who you've become, she continued, her voice thick with emotion, but steady with conviction. "You proved me wrong about everything, and I'm grateful you did. I'm grateful you were stubborn enough to ignore my doubts, brave enough to bet on yourself when no one else would, smart enough to see possibilities I was too scared to imagine." I walked around my desk and hugged my mother, really hugged her, for the first time since I was a child, and still believed she could fix anything that was broken. Still trusted that her presence could make the world feel safer and more manageable. She felt smaller in my arms than she had in my memories, more fragile, more human, less like the towering authority figure of my childhood and more like what she'd always been, woman trying to do her best with the tools and knowledge she had. Trying to protect the people she loved even when her methods caused the very pain she was trying to prevent. "Mom," I said, my voice muffled against her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with the hospital smell that never quite washed out of her clothes. The combination that had meant home and safety and complicated love. "Throughout my childhood, I want you to know something. I didn't build this to prove you wrong. I built it to prove myself right. There's a difference." She pulled back to look at me, her hands on my shoulders, and I saw understanding in her eyes. Recognition of a distinction that mattered more than I'd realized. That spoke to motivation and purpose, and the difference between revenge and self-actualization. "The job is yours if you want it," I said, stepping back and trying to return some professional distance to the moment. Though the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted, though we both knew that whatever happened next would be built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect rather than old grudges and unresolved resentments. "But I need you to understand something," I said, my voice steady but softer now, as I leaned slightly forward, placing both hands flat on the desk between us, as if the solidity of the surface could anchor the weight of what I was about to say. I held her gaze, not aggressively, not with challenge, but with the kind of focused clarity that only comes when you're speaking a truth you've wrestled with for a long time. "This isn't just a conversation between a mother and her daughter. Not right now. Not in this space. Because here in this office, surrounded by these walls, under this roof, with these clients depending on us and this team looking to me for leadership, I'm not your daughter. I'm your boss. And if this is going to work, really work, you have to be able to live with that. Can you handle it?" I let the words settle. They were deliberate, not cruel, but they needed to be said without apology. This wasn't about pride or ego, it was about clarity, about creating a space where we could both succeed without the ghosts of our past intruding every time a decision had to be made. It was about more than just job titles or org charts. It was about power dynamics, about emotional roles we'd each been forced to play for years, and the courage it would take to step outside of them. The question wasn't hypothetical, and it wasn't rhetorical. It was real, tangible in the air. Between us. The kind of question that doesn't just determine how a project goes or whether an employee gets onboarded properly. It was the kind of question that could reshape the fabric of a relationship. Could she take direction from me without feeling diminished? Could she see my authority as something earned rather than something that threatened her? Could she offer input, raise concerns, disagree with me even without it turning into a revival of every unresolved argument we'd had when I was 16 and angry, or when she was exhausted and too proud to admit she needed help? More than that, could she respect me professionally without expecting me to fix our personal history at the same time? Could she let the past stay in the past long enough for us to build something new, here in the present? She was quiet at first, and for a moment I wasn't sure how it would land. The air felt heavy, charged, as if we were both holding our breath, not from fear. Exactly, but from the awareness that this moment was bigger than either of us wanted to admit out loud. Then, slowly, I saw something shift in her expression. Her eyes softened, her shoulders eased ever so slightly, and her lips curled into a smile, not the tight, courteous kind she usually wore like a shield, but something warmer, more alive. A smile that had texture and history to it. A smile that looked like her, like the version of her I remembered from before things got hard, before the weight of single motherhood and financial survival dulled her spark. "I think I can learn," she said at last. Her voice wasn't loud, But it didn't need to be. It carried. There was something in the way she said it, a tremor just under the surface, as if the words had traveled a long road inside her before making it out. Her tone was low, a little uneven, rough in places, like something unpolished but real. Not rehearsed, not wrapped in pride or coated with false confidence, just honest. So honest, in fact, that it hit me with a force I didn't expect. And I believed her. Not because it sounded perfect or certain, because it didn't, but because it sounded true. She wasn't making one of those sweeping, sentimental declarations people give when they want to smooth over conflict without actually dealing with it. She wasn't trying to impress me or perform growth. She wasn't pretending she already knew how to navigate this complicated terrain we were about to enter, where every conversation might risk brushing up against old wounds or long-buried expectations. She wasn't promising perfection or pretending this would be easy. We both knew that habits, especially the deeply rooted ones shaped by family, fear, and survival, don't vanish overnight. They show up when you least expect them, in the sharpness of a tone, the silence after a disagreement, the way you unconsciously retreat or bristle when something feels too close to the bone. But what she was offering was willingness. She was telling me in the most unadorned way possible that she was open to learning, to trying, to failing sometimes, but coming back and trying again. And there was something quietly powerful about that dot, and beneath that willingness, there was a different energy too. Something softer, maybe even a little fragile, but unmistakably present. Hope, not the naive fairy tale kind that believes everything will magically resolve, but the harder kind. The hope that grows out of disappointment, not in spite of it. The hope that says, we've seen the worst of each other and we're still here. We're tired, we're scarred, but we're still choosing to reach for something better, because this wasn't just about a job offer or a new chapter in either of our careers. This was about something far more sacred, the possibility of rewriting. A story that had long seemed set in stone. A story shaped by sacrifice and misunderstanding, by too many unsaid things and too many moments when we had both felt unseen. This was about the chance, however tentative, to forge a new relationship. One not dictated by the rigid hierarchy of mother and daughter, where power had always been uneven and emotions too entangled to sort cleanly. But one rooted in mutual respect, in recognition, in the understanding that we were now two grown women who had survived different storms and carried different scars, but who might, if we were careful and intentional, learn how to stand beside one another instead of across. And in that moment, as I sat across from her, watching her vulnerability turn into resolve, something inside me shifted too. I realized I wanted this too. Work not out of obligation or guilt, not because it would be easier than the alternative, but because something in me believed we were ready for this. I wanted to build something real with her, something that didn't rely on old roles or emotional shortcuts. Something we could be proud of, not just for the sake of the business. Not just for appearances, but for us, because for the first time in a long time, it felt like we might be possible again.